and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of its 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from fiction, non-fiction, and poetry to screenwriting and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the non-fiction author and novelist Anna Funder.
We spoke to Anna about moving from the law to writing, investigating the secret police of East Germany in Stasi-land, and her latest book, Wifedom.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Anna, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with Wifedom? When did you first come across Eileen O'Shaughnessy and then later Orwell?
Well, I found myself in the end of summer 2017 at home in Sydney with 3 kids, 2 kind of adolescents and a smaller one, all going back to school. And I found myself in this shopping mall, a kind of horrible, soulless place, actually, pushing this huge cart of groceries ahead of me and dragging a rather depressed French exchange student behind me. And I just had this moment of kind of privileged perimenopausal meltdown where I thought, what has happened to my life? And so I actually put this scene in the book. Instead of going home, I went around the corner and I went into this second-hand bookshop from the 1970s. I think it must have started as a lesbian bookshop. It's called Sappho. I don't know what Orwell would make, actually, of having been found in a lesbian bookshop. But I went upstairs and I found this lovely, cheap paperback first edition of his collected essays, letters and journalism. And I took that home, and I think a more sensible person would have, gone and started meditating or got a really good shrink or something, or gone on HRT, which I eventually did. But I read my way through Orwell, and I think what I was doing was trying to watch him create his writing self through these small sequential pieces and letters, because I was wondering what had happened to my writing self, I think. And after that, I wasn't cured. So I started reading the biographies, and there are 6 major biographies of Orwell. So I read my way through those with great enjoyment. I mean, I did kind of take time off to sort of vaguely look after children and things. But at the end of the biographies, I still wasn't cured. And I kept sort of tootling around in Orwell, who I love, and then came across these letters from Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who was married to Orwell for his great creative period, from 36 to 45. And those letters were only discovered in 2005, after all of these biographies had been written. The last of them were published in 2003. And in the first of them, Eileen writes to her best friend from Oxford days. She's been married 6 months, and the friend lives in Bristol. Her name is Nora, and Eileen hasn't been able to get away to see her. And she writes, "Dear Nora, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to write to you, but we have quarrelled so continuously and really bitterly since the wedding that I thought I'd just write one letter to everyone once the murder or separation was accomplished. And when I read that, I just thought, who are you? You're hilarious and clever. And what have you been fighting about in these first months of wifedom as you get kind of used to the new job? And why do you want to kill him, even in jest? So that really sent me down the rabbit hole of finding out who she was, because she didn't appear in the biographies, and how and why it was that, first of all, Orwell, in, say, Homage to Catalonia, and the letters and journalism and essays, and then these 6 biographers had effectively made a woman disappear. So wifedom is about finding her, looking at the methods by which the work and lives of women are made invisible and disappeared in our lifetimes and in history. And then I very, very luckily got permission to use the letters. So there are these imagined scenes using real letters because I wanted Eileen to live again on the page for the reader. Sorry, that's such a long answer, but that's really how I came to it.
And what were the circumstances that these letters had emerged? Where had they been in the intervening decades, and how did they come to life?
Yes, not a lot is known about that, or at least not by me. Eileen had been one of the very early women to graduate from Oxford, so in the early 20s. I think that women had only been given degrees for the last sort of 4 years. She was quite early, and she read English at St. Hugh's under Tolkien, among others. So she was very familiar with animal fables, which might be something that we get to. But her best friend at St. Hugh's was a woman called Nora Symes Miles. And Nora married a doctor and lived in Bristol. And she lived into the 90s, whereas Eileen died a long, long time before that. And after she died, these letters were then kept in the family, I suppose, and they were discovered, I think, they were discovered by her nephew. So I can't remember whether this is actually true or whether I've made it up, but I think that they were in the nephew's garage, and they came to light in 2005. But Eileen and George were pretty kind of, I longed for letters between them, but there are not very many. And some of these 6 that were discovered, and there are some others, are from Eileen to George, and they're extremely moving, but it's not as if there's a copious amount of correspondence between them. They were quite sort of careless about things like that, or very unsentimental. And actually at one point, Orwell was seen to be burning letters that a friend thought were probably from Eileen. So these seemed to be very precious.
Given the burning and the fact that she was written out of all of these biographies and other kind of accounts of Orwell's life, how difficult was it to undertake the research?
Yes, it was hard. It was mind-bendingly hard. I mean, always when I talk about this, I suppose it's like anything in life. I'm talking about something in retrospect, and it's done, and this thing exists. But at the time I was doing it, I didn't know what I was doing, so I didn't have a plan. I always think that writing is, I think this is hopefully not just me, but it's, we are walking on a tightrope, but at the same time, we are making that tightrope kind of word by word. So you don't know where it's going, you don't know where it attaches to at the other end, which is, I suppose, a complicated way of saying I didn't know what I was doing. After I'd read the murder or separation letter, I went back and looked at these biographies that I just devoured and opened them up to the newlywed parts, where these biographers who were all men mentioned briefly the situation that Orwell's sort of post-nuptial bliss, basically. And they say things like, Orwell had never been happier before or since. Conditions were idyllic for him. So they were living in a tiny, decrepit cottage with no electricity, one cold tap, and an outdoor loo in Wallington, a village 50 miles outside of London. So conditions were idyllic for him. But I thought, this woman who wants to kill him or separate and is clearly doing all the work, she is making those conditions. So in that realization, then that leads me to think, well, the passive voice is one way in which she is being erased, because conditions were idyllic. Those conditions have no maker who exists in that sentence. So that would set me off reading their biographies to look. I became hugely sensitized to when there was something written in the passive voice. The baby was collected. The visas were obtained. These things were done by women, often by Eileen. My main way of doing it was to look then very closely at the sources, at the footnotes and endnotes of the biographers, and to go and read their sources and to see who had done what, and then also what they had left out of her account. So there's a very good friend of Eileen's called Lydia Jackson, who was, when Eileen met George, she was studying for a master's in psychology at UCL, and one of the other students was a very clever Russian emigre, very clear-eyed, who loved both, or particularly Eileen, but also George in some ways. And she left an essay about Eileen, and she wrote about Eileen in her memoirs. But she wrote some very critical things of George. I mean, George really sexually assaulted her, harassed her, but then they had some kind of relationship in the relatively early married days, which George then tried to flaunt in front of Eileen in a kind of cruel way. Lydia writes about that, and that shows us what George was doing, and also that he wanted Eileen to know that he was at least wanting to have sex, if not having sex, with one of her closest friends. And I think that's a kind of manipulative and isolating and cruel thing to do. So there's evidence of that, but that evidence is left out of the biographer's accounts because it's too difficult to square, I think, this is my reading, with a version of the Orwell we want to know and love, who is a decent man who wouldn't continuously and cruelly betray his wife, for instance. So I was fascinated by those sources. I found other sources that the biographers hadn't used, most particularly about Eileen's time in Spain. So, we can read Homage to Catalonia, a book I loved and read as a teen and read again, and never really had the sense that Orwell was there with anyone else. But Eileen was there almost the whole time he was there. And what was really important is that she had a political job at the headquarters of the ILP, the International Labour Party, the party he was fighting for. So he was off in a trench and had a kind of sketchy understanding of what was going on from that vantage point, of course. And she was right at the heart of it in Barcelona, but written out of his account in interesting ways as well. So reading Homage to Catalonia, this big section of my book that I was, I spent longer writing the Spain section of wifedom than Eileen and George spent in Spain, something that deeply embarrasses me. But to unravel Homage to Catalonia, it was kind of like unraveling a cobweb, because every time he uses a passive voice or things are done on one page, but you find out who did them a few pages later, if it was a woman or something done to a woman. It was very difficult, but I found a fantastic source that the biographers hadn't used, who was Eileen's boss in that office in Spain, an economist, an American called Charles Orr, who thought that Eileen, compared to all of the revolutionaries and grifters and political activists and spies who drifted through their head office, he said Eileen was a superior person, something that no biographer uses. So it was a combination of sources, archives, and then unraveling accounts to look behind the passive voice, really.
So the book was published last year and received a lot of praise, but there was also quite significant pushback in some quarters, and you had to make some changes. Could you tell us about that kind of experience, and what was the response from all the different sides of the debate when it emerged?
So I don't think it's a significant pushback, to be honest, and I can tell you why. There were, to my knowledge, 3 errors in this book. The book is 400 pages long and has 40 pages of endnotes, which any page that you're on in the book, if there's a quote or a fact or something, you just flick to the end and you find where it came from. There were, very regrettably, 3 errors. As far as we know, they were corrected in very early editions of the book. One was Orwell's mother's family came from Burma. Ida was a feminist Fabian and suffragette who was educated in England, or her sister was a suffragette, but Ida was a feminist and Fabian. And so the family was in Burma, but they were stationed in Bengal when Orwell was born. So I had Bengal, it should have been Burma. The baby they adopted, his birth name was Richard Robertson. At one point I put Robinson. It was actually an error from Sylvia Topp's book, which I regrettably reproduced. So Robertson has been changed to Robinson. And I had a woman called Celia Kerwin turning up at Jura among a list of guests who turn up at Jura, and she didn't go, so I replaced that with Sally. So those are 3 errors in the book, as I say, hugely regrettable. I must tell you that the biographies have many, many errors in them. And this seems to me a case of really what I am saying is underlying this book is in order to make a picture of Orwell as this mythological, decent human being, what has to happen, which is a fiction that we would like to believe in, some people more than others. The women who made him, he came from a female-dominated, female-led family. As I say, his aunt was a suffragette who was arrested with the Pankhursts and put in prison. She ran a literary salon in London to which luminaries like H.G. Wells were invited and so on. So Orwell has this, these women are interested in left-wing politics, they're interested in feminism, they're interested in gender roles. His Aunt Nellie sent Orwell, material about sex and gender roles, which was basically, they were involved in a conversation about how women are not born into this sort of subservient role. So the man who grows up to be a left-wing writer who looks at things from an underdog point of view, that inheritance of left-wing feminist women you would think is very important, but that's not something that you'll find in the biographies. You just hear about him through the male line. And similarly with his wife. So this book is called Wifedom. It's mainly about Eileen. It's what she brought, which was an enormous amount, intellectually and in every way, to this marriage. And on the other hand, what has to be gotten rid of is what Orwell did to women, which, as I say, was, and did to Eileen. So there was an enormous amount of infidelity with women during the marriage, with women of varying degrees of willing. One of the biographers, a couple of them probably, I think, one is certainly coins the term the Orwell pounce, quote unquote, to describe how he would pounce on women in literary magazines, at the BBC, at parties, in parks, and so on. So that's very difficult also to square with the image that readers might want to have of this upstanding, everyman icon of decency. And I'm looking at that in Wifedom saying, this mechanism of deleting what a man owes and gets from women, importantly, intellectually, psychologically, as well as what we now call domestic and emotional labour, and what he does to women. In this case, really, I suppose, I don't call it this in the book, but the behaviour looks like sexual assault. It's certainly the women who left accounts of it felt it to be unwanted in many cases, but wanted in some cases. So these are the reasons for women being gotten rid of. And that is done by methods, as I say, like the passive voice, but also like attacks on the credibility of women who were very good friends of Orwell's, loved him, knew him very well. In particular, say, an example, a woman called Mabel Fearts, who found him his first agent, encouraged him enormously, found him a flat, was lovers with him for a while, knew him very well. So she will be, when she says something difficult, like some of Orwell's behaviour looked to her like disappointed homosexuality, for instance. She will be denigrated by a biographer as a bit of a crank, say. There was a small article, I think, in The Guardian, and it's coming out of an Orwell fan club called the Orwell Society, and some friends of Orwell's. The patron is Orwell's son, Richard Blair, and the secretary is a man called Quentin Kopp. I actually travelled with Richard and Quentin, who was enormously helpful to me, because the Society publishes a kind of newsletter pamphlet that was very useful. And they organised tours to Orwell's grave or to Paris. And I went on one to Barcelona, which was really wonderful. So they were enormously helpful, but it's very difficult, I think, for them. I think it's very difficult to see all of this material that they would rather not see about Orwell. And so to find three, let's face it, very small, if infinitely regrettable and utterly my fault errors in a very big book, rather than looking at the errors which are large in the culture that's doing this. So that's where this is I think, coming from. And I have to tell you, I feel that describing it as an attack on me or on the book, I was expecting much worse. They haven't found any errors in what I'm saying. And I think it's just shooting their messenger in a way, because they know that the story of Eileen and of these other women is true. And they can see it in I hasten to say that, there are 40 pages of endnotes that tie all of these accounts of the women into the evidence that they've given. So, yeah, I think that's where we're at with that.
Have you had any letters or anything from kind of disgruntled Orwell fans?
No, interestingly, because if you write a feminist book, I suppose you expect that. They haven't contacted me. Orwell wasn't only, pouncing on women. There were women who found him very attractive, and he had significant affairs, long affairs, during his marriage with them. One of them was a woman called Inez Holden. Eileen worked to support Orwell in all ways during the whole marriage, but in particular financially. And during the war, she worked at the Department of Censorship in the Ministry of Information in Senate House in Bloomsbury, which he later took as the model for the Ministry of Truth, i.e. lies.
So I was about to say, I wonder where that might have popped up in his work.
Yes. While Eileen was off at working in these jobs, George went for a walk in Regent's Park with Inez Holden, who was a friend of H.G. Wells and who he found very attractive. And then they went back to Eileen and George's flat to go to bed together. And Inez leaves, who was a writer and journalist, she leaves this account saying, we went back to the flat and Orwell disappeared into the other room. And when he came out, he was dressed in his Home Guard uniform. And then he pounced on her, to use the biographer's euphemism, with intensity and urgency that she found astonishing. So I was picking up these kind of offcuts and looking at them, I suppose, from a woman's point of view, thinking, you go back to the flat to have sex with Orwell, who you must find attractive, and instead of getting undressed and getting into bed, he goes and puts on his military uniform. So what does that actually mean? So I think these things, which are very interesting to us today, and they're particularly interesting, I suppose, from a woman's point of view about what that means, these are the sorts of things that are quite difficult if you want to see Orwell as a normal / heterosexual / decent / faithful man of integrity. And Inez says then, we went out to dinner that night with Eileen as well, and there seemed to be rather an atmosphere of submerged strain. So George wasn't, I don't think, keeping these things from Eileen. I think he wanted her to feel it. And that's actually what's more interesting, in a way, than the actual infidelity, is this kind of psychological cruelty by isolating someone in their own marriage in a way.
Could we roll back now away from Orwell and to your early life? So growing up in Australia, and you initially worked as a lawyer before moving to Berlin in the 1990s. Could you tell us about, that period of your life and that decision to change tracks in your career?
Yes. So I was briefly quite a bad lawyer, I think. But I wasn't in a position to do anyone any harm, which is a relief to me now. I look back on it. I read English and German at university and also did a law degree. And I had a really brilliant international law teacher. So I did a lot of international law and human rights law with Hilary Charlesworth, who's now on the ICJ. And she was a great inspiration. And after I qualified, I worked for a couple of years in a really brilliant office for the Australian government called the Office of International Law. We were a small unit negotiating treaties for Australia and working on the implementation of international law, in particular human rights, environmental and space law in Australia. So I did that. But it came to the point where I had brilliant and lovely colleagues doing kind of dream work for an international lawyer, really. But I realized that as I sat there in my 20s in this corral in Canberra, that everybody else was really engaged in their real lives. But I was taking notes. And I think I felt like I was betraying someone or something, if not them, then certainly me. And I saved up the money that I could save, and I left Canberra, I left the law, I left my career, I left my boyfriend, I left my country, and I went to Berlin and spent 1997 there researching what would become Stasiland. I think I was putting myself in a situation where I would have very little choice. I put myself in a corner that I would have to write myself out of. I had studied in Berlin, I have to say, as a student, as an undergraduate when the war was still up. I studied in West Berlin at the Freie Universität, and at that time in 87, 88, I had met East German writers and artists who had been kicked out of East Germany. So they were extraordinary people to me. They were kind of artistic and personal lodestars. I admired them enormously, but they had left their wives and children, lovers, parents on the other side of the wall. And I think I thought then, what kind of regime kicks out its best and brightest? So I went back in 97 to find out about that regime and mostly about the people who resisted. So in Stasiland, there are 4 main stories of people, ordinary people who resist that regime. I mean, it was an utterly Orwellian regime, just to bring us back to Orwell as lodestar, I suppose.
I saw that you had placed adverts in a newspaper for meetings with people that had worked in the Stasi. Once they'd responded to you, how did you get people to open up? Did you have a particular strategy, or was it just a case of being open and straightforward?
Yes, well, I didn't mean to do that. Well, I only made part of it. So I found the story of Miriam, which is the central kind of anchor story in Stasiland. Miriam, as a 16-year-old, tried to climb the Berlin Wall, which was it sounds like the most dramatic thing that happened in her life, but it wasn't by far. And her story was the story of immense moral courage, really for her whole life. She's still alive. And once I found that story, I then started to realize this process of creating the tightrope that you're walking along because you're discovering what it is that you're so interested in. I was finding that I didn't want the stories of the famous resistors and civil rights activists. I wanted to find out what it was like to be a so-called ordinary person and refuse to participate in the sort of Ponzi scheme of fear and betrayal, of surveillance, which was how the GDR ran, and to refuse to betray those around you to the Stasi. But I realized I was going to have to meet some Stasi men the Stasi was in German, it's called a Männerclub. People referred to it as it was a very male organisation run on military lines. But 1 in 7 people were either employed by the Stasi or reporting to the Stasi in the population. They had all gone to ground in 97 because they could have been sued or aggressed or lynched, or they didn't know what was going to happen to them. So they'd sort of disappeared themselves. I met a woman at a party who said, you'll never find any to talk to you. And I said, why? And she said, because I'm doing my master's on the Stasi and I have written 148 letters and put them in the letterbox of apartment blocks in Marzahn or Potsdam, where lots of Stasi people live. And I got only anonymous replies, 4 of them, reasons why they wouldn't talk to me. And I just thought, I don't have the patience to do that. So I thought I'll take out an advertisement in the Märkische Allgemeine, which was the local paper. This is a pre-internet days, how ancient I am, 97. And also they were probably not very computer literate, those men. So I speak German, but I had somebody a German native speaker vet my ad. But when it went in, it was mistakenly put into the personal columns of the Märkische Allgemeine, which I suppose is a Tinder-esque type of place to end up. And the ad said, Australian writer seeks Stasi men, view conversation. Anyway, my phone ran hot. I was living in this decrepit flat that I loved in the former East, and the phone rang. So I was dealing with a group of self-selected men who wanted to tell their story, and I had a series of meetings with them, which were very funny and very revealing. Some of them wanted to play spies and said, I will meet you at 1300 hours in the square in Potsdam. I will have the, Märkische Allgemeine rolled up under my left arm. You will recognize me, blah, blah, blah. They wanted to talk to me, so that was one thing. I think that they thought, here is a young woman from the other end of the planet, so she will not be prejudiced against us like West Germans are prejudiced against us. Had I been American or British, I think they would have had a sense of what that meant to them. But being Australian, I didn't realise it at the time was an advantage. They thought I was from Mars. And one of them actually said, he gave me a copy of the Communist Manifesto and said to me, well, now maybe with this, you will be able to spread the socialism in a corner of the world that is not prejudiced against us. They were very unhappy with the book, I have to say. I mean, an organisation of former Stasi sued me, my then publisher, after that book came out. So yes, I have a little bit of history, I think, now in aggressing, in annoying people who would like stories not to be told. But the way that I actually got them to talk to me was simply by, people like to talk about themselves, in my experience. And some of them asked for my passport because they couldn't believe I wasn't German. I wish my German was still that good. So I had to prove my identity to them. But I recorded everything, and I also took notes in a notebook, which I think was fantastic, actually. Because I would be looking down at the notebook, which meant that eye contact was broken, and I think that meant that they felt less observed and they were freer to talk really freely in those moments. And I was taking notes in German, taking notes in English, but taking notes about what they were saying, about the next question, about the room we were in, about why it had so many fake flowers or porcelain bunnies, or why his wife kept interrupting him, or whatever it was. So I think they were men who wanted to talk, who felt they weren't being listened to.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
And we always like on the podcast to get into the mechanics of how people got published, particularly initially. So with Stasiland, how did you find a publisher? And what was all that process like?
So I had this series of stories, these 4 main stories: a student, a schoolgirl, a housewife whose baby ended up on the wrong side, whose very, very ill baby was being treated in a hospital in West Berlin when the war went up overnight, really, in August 1961. She was a dental technician who just wanted to be a mother, and she ended up trying to escape. And Klaus Renft, this lovely kind of semi-alcoholic Mick Jagger of the Eastern Bloc. Those stories, and then I had the Stasi men stories, and I had to weave them into a narrative that would make sense. I'd grown up reading Bruce Chatwin, reading Richard Kapuscinski, later Sebald. So I was looking at ways of... My stories are these... I wanted them to be more closely linked to fact, because I was also writing the stories of people who resisted the regime, and those stories were not being told at that time, and in fact have not really been honoured in the 30 years since. So as a work of witness, I needed the book to be really truer than, say, Chatwin or Sebald. But so I put myself into that book just as a way of showing what Berlin was like, as it was this crazy city in the 90s with ex-Stasi and ex-victim resistors walking around in it. And that present tense narrative of my life was the glue. Look, I was very naive, and I had a very nice kind of literary friend who was an editor at Meandrin, the very famous journal, kindly read it for me. I had a kind of mentorship program with the Australian Society of Authors, where a lovely poet called John Tranter read it for me. They just said, it's fine, send it. I had no idea. I actually only sent it to one publisher, and then I asked another man, a friend of my parents who was in publishing, do you think that's all right? And this publisher came back to me and said, we want to publish this, offered me an extraordinarily paltry amount of money. But I was just so grateful and astonished not to be rejected that I took this paltry amount of money and felt happy about it. And that was beginning of a kind of career marked by lack of nous about money, I suppose. So it was very lucky in some ways not to be rejected. I've got a bit wiser since about contracts and publishers, but that was my path to publishing.
Stasiland was this huge international hit, right? It won the Samuel Johnson Prize, as well as very widely translated. What was the experience from, as you say, you were kind of naive to the ways of publishing beforehand, and then having this smash, really? And what was that experience like? And then also, what was following up and moving on from that? Often when we've had writers who've had a very big hit, they talk about how it's wonderful in many ways, but it can also bring challenges too.
Yes, it was really wonderful, actually. I'm kind of eternally grateful for having won Samuel Johnson. When I got it, I was sort of similarly clueless. I was about 7 months pregnant with my second child and had no idea that would happen. I went along to the dinner thinking, I'm so lucky to be here at the Savoy Hotel. I'm so lucky to be here. And then, I was whisked away, and there was this sort of phalanx of reporters. It was like a scene from some movie calling my name so that I would look at them over my vast belly. And I didn't even realize that wasn't happening to all the other people who were shortlisted. Anyway, it was a kind of dream. But that was important, because otherwise what you have effectively is an unknown writer writing her first book about a country that doesn't exist anymore. And even when it did exist, no one was interested in it. So that's not a kind of surefire publishing thing. So that was really good. Then I found myself with two small children. When Stasiland first came out, my first child was 6 weeks old. When it won the Samuel Johnson, I was pregnant with my second. So I spent a few years kind of trying to write another novel at the same time as literally almost juggling two small children. That novel didn't really go anywhere, except that the main character was going to be Ruth, who is then the main character in All That I Am. So then I wrote All That I Am. When it came out in Australia and it won the Miles Franklin, which is Australia's most was the big fiction prize in the nation, and many, many other prizes. But when that happened, by that time I was living in the States, in Brooklyn. So I didn't feel that success of All That I Am at all. And it was theoretical to me. So I was literally, recording speeches on my phone, having bought time from a babysitter for whatever award it was in Australia and sending them back, whilst I was a complete nobody in the US. So I've had these really very different experiences. I still think the Samuel Johnson, it was a big turning point for me. I don't think it made any actual writing any easier, but I'm sure it made publishing easier. I think it's reassuring for publishers to think, well, this book went well in, 25 countries, and so then the next one might as well. So then it's published in lots of countries, and, Wifedom is rolling out now. But I think the books are so different in some ways and so sort of out there that, I'm always grateful for whatever publishing attention they get, really. Yeah.
Could we talk now about All That I Am, the novel you just mentioned? When did you decide you also wanted to write fiction?
So I'm one of those people who has always known in a way that they were a writer, a bit like always knowing that you're right-handed or very uncoordinated or other things. So I've known that about myself since I was extremely small, about 6. I don't know why it is. I feel like it's a sort of born that way situation. But I did start school in France, and so I immediately, or within 6 months or something, became bilingual. And I think that I was sort of then born into an utter fascination with language and a certainty that the only way I would be able to live my life was through it and by writing. When I was starting writing Stasiland, I started to write it as a novel because that's what I always thought I would do. And I realized then very quickly that the work was astonishingly bad, just execrable on the page in its own right. But also it had, those aesthetic problems were moral problems. And they came, I think, from the writing point of view, because it was not the right thing to be doing at that time in the 90s, to be taking other people's stories as material and using them in a novel, because a novel would privilege my voice and kind of use them as fuel for my own purposes. This is actually a kind of aesthetic and moral dilemma that comes up for Ernst Toller as well in character in All That I Am. So I decided that because those stories weren't being told, I had to tell it as nonfiction so that that book would sit as a kind of testament to them. So I wrote that book as nonfiction. It worked out much better. With All That I Am, I was writing the real story of a woman who was a dear friend of mine who had been part of an anti-Hitler movement in the 30s. She was a left-wing Jewish intellectual. And as soon as Hitler came to power, this story takes place long before the start of the war. She and her friends were exiled in London. And 2 of them ended up being killed, I believe, in very or dying at any rate, in very mysterious circumstances, together in bed, these 2 women, one fully dressed, one in her pajamas, poisoned in the locked room of a top-floor flat in Bloomsbury in 1935. So that was a story I've always known. It's a true story. But the task of that exercise was to bring those women back to life. And the suspense of that book, All That I Am, is that they want to keep living, even at the same time as they are utterly prepared, as activists sometimes are, we see this a lot today, to throw their lives away. So the suspense of the book is they want to keep living, but what they are doing is threatening their lives at every turn because there are Nazi agents so early on in London in 33, 34, 35. So to make them live again, that had to be a novel. I had an absolute ball writing that novel, but it is also, again, it's a novel with end notes, rather bizarrely. So you finish it and you can see what Dora Fabian wrote, if you want to go and see it. You can see how they died. You can see the whitewash of the inquiry into their deaths and so on. So that's why that was a novel. And All That I Am is this, All That I Am, Wifedom, is now a kind of hybrid because, again, I wanted Eileen to live again. I didn't want to write an account of this woman. I wanted to use her, starting with her murder or separation letter and then using all the others, bring her back to life. So I do write scenes in which she lives, often writing those letters because I know where she was. I know what she's leaving out of the letters. She leaves out of that first one that Orwell's about to go to Spain. She leaves out that he's in bed with another woman and she knows it. She writes very moving letters to him towards the end. And I got permission to use those letters, which was really lucky. So those sections are indented and run ragged, and it's clear that they're fiction. And in the audiobook, it's another voice. But they sit then in my text, which is a biography of the marriage and an account of why it is that even today these forces that invisibilize the work of women, mothers, wives, are still in play. So you've got these parts of the book that hopefully speak to each other.
It's a rule of the show that we ask every guest about money. So how has it worked for you? How easy or difficult has it been to make a living from writing once you made that move into Berlin?
Yes. So I think it's really a paradox when I think about writers and money, because of course, in some cases you wouldn't be a writer if you had a choice. If I had any other talents or sense of myself, it would probably be more sensible to be someone else, but I'm not. I'm this person. And so sort of almost by definition not that interested in money, because it's not something where you expect to make very much money. It's not the aim. The aim is to put something beautiful into the world that is an object that hasn't been there before, of both kind of delight and witness, I think, is the aim. But the paradox of not caring about money is, of course, you have to think about it an awful lot because you don't have any. So you live in this kind of contradiction. I saved up money from working in these law jobs. I mean, it wasn't like I was a big corporate lawyer. I was working in government law, but I didn't have very many expenses and saved up money so that I could go and live in Berlin for that time. Lived in an extremely dingy East German flat, which almost becomes a character in Stasiland. And then I came back to Australia, and to write up the book, I needed a part-time job. So I got a job which I thought was going to be writing narration for documentaries at ABC Television. And it turned out to be a bit bigger, and it kind of expanded into my life, and I ended up being associate producer on some documentaries. So I would say beware of the part-time job that you choose where you think it's going to support your writing, and it can then kind of take up more time than you need. I like documentary form, but I was trying to write as well. Then my mother died, and I just got completely sort of, I think you don't know what your emotional trajectory is going to be either. So it can be something really just sideswipes you so that you can no longer find the self that you were writing from, so you just don't know what's going to happen to you. But with money, so yeah, my husband's an architect. He started his own firm during a recession in the 90s in Melbourne. So he's a creative person who also wasn't very interested in money and didn't have any. Then we moved to Sydney and both of us were unemployed. So I'm trying to give you this account of being able to survive on not much money. I then enrolled in a PhD. So there were these creative PhDs that were offered by the University of Technology, where I'm still a big fan of this university and still associated with it. So I got a Commonwealth scholarship, which I think was $25,000 a year, but it meant that I could access the university childcare. So you're always making kind of strategic decisions about how to fund time. And when you have children, you realize that your life that time is is money. Every hour costs, at that time, $25. So of nanny time when they're too small to go into the childcare. So that's how I did it. I think after Stasi Land and All That I Am, I mean, the books were selling. I was getting advances. I was getting options, and somehow or other it all kind of works.
You've lived and worked in Australia, in Europe, and in the US, and we were wondering what your thoughts are on the kind of distinct literary cultures of those three societies. Just at a very kind of banal level, but is it true that just in Australia books are a lot more expensive, was one thing that we'd heard from here. But I mean, just on the broader question of, what's been your experience of the relative merits or challenges of those three different worlds that you've inhabited?
That's a very big question because it's an economic question. It's a question about publishing and book selling and independent bookstores and Amazon and advances and audiences and readers and feedback. But it is a lovely thing to be published in. This Wifedom came out in the States and the US and the UK at around the same time. And I've toured in the UK and Australia a lot and a little bit in the US. And I get reader responses from all those places at the same time. So books, just to address your question properly, books are very expensive in Australia, which is a shame. They're so expensive that Wifedom was published in extremely fine hardcover editions in the UK and the US. In Australia, it was published in a very lovely, what's called trade paperback, like a very large paperback. I think because probably to put it into hardback would just have made it so expensive it wouldn't have sold, and they're not putting it into the small format because it's sold in 10 months, over 100,000 copies just in Australia alone. So they're continuing with this big one without going into the small paperback. And I think that is because books are in general so expensive. So I think it sells for like $36 or something. It's quite a lot. And that's a big paperback. But that said, Amazon hasn't made the kinds of inroads into the publishing industry in Australia that it has elsewhere. We have a local online bookseller called Booktopia that has kind of kept Amazon at bay. We have a very big independent, thriving independent bookstore sector. I know you do here as well. I think to a slightly less extent in the States, The reader feedback is the thing that really interests me, and the audiences. So in Australia, the audiences for all books, actually, and it's not just a kind of feminist book called Wifedom, are very largely women. A lot of women in so I toured Australia for 2 weeks and big events, and then have done quite numbers of festivals. Those audiences are, I don't know what the percentage would be, but 80, maybe 90% women. In the UK, there are a lot more men. And I don't know whether that's because there are a lot of Orwell fans who are men who are coming along, or whether at a certain level, men and the audiences are just differently skewed. And there are people who are just reading kind of everything and going to everything. I've had extraordinarily lovely emails from men, more British men and American and Canadian than Australian, but some Australian, which have been about, essentially, I've picked up your book because of Orwell, and now I'm reading it shocked at who he was, although it makes more sense to understand him better when I think about his work, that he was a more complex human being. But it's also made me look at my own life. Did my marriage end because I could not see this invisible work of my wife? What was it that she was saying to me that I couldn't hear? And your book has made me think about those things. And that is an extraordinary, almost makes me cry thinking about it, actually. That is those sorts of things to say. The letters were so beautiful. They're kind of just so brave and so open and so touching, really. I mean, one British man painted a picture of Eileen and said, "I will send it to you." He's a painter. And I thought, who are you? I, don't know who you are. But I just said, of course, that's very lovely. Can you send it to me? Anyway, he sends me this oil painting in the post, and it is astonishingly beautiful. I mean, he's a really accomplished painter. So I think that there's a slight difference of gender in readership. That's what I've really noticed.
That must be extremely gratifying to have had that kind of impact on people with your work.
It's frightening a little bit, actually. I have to say, it's a little bit frightening.
Responsible for divorces up and down, up and down the world.
In Australia, the audience response, I think perhaps Australia is more macho or something. I don't know, but the audience responses, there will be, which are largely women, there will be kind of uproar and cheers and kind of clapping at moments where I don't think there's going to be clapping, where I haven't stopped talking kind of thing. And I think it's like this venting of female rage. Gloria Steinem says, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And so I think this book has been slightly a lightning rod for that in Australia. But I have always felt when I'm writing, sometimes I'm writing something that I find myself very upsetting or very, sometimes funny or moving or something. Particularly in All That I Am, some of the Toller scenes where he's very depressed in the Mayflower Hotel in New York. And it sounds sort of bizarre because I made them up, but I still find them very moving. I got used to Eileen and I got used to George's behaviour over the 7 years of writing this book. But then I see what it does to people to read it. And I feel like saying, I'm so sorry that I did this to you, but it will be all right. But it's kind of testament to the power of words. You're really inside someone else's head and kind of walking around in there, knocking into the furniture and rearranging it. And I feel that that's the power of writing, but I also feel a little bit guilty, I think.
We've come towards the end of our time, but as a brief final question from me, your husband has said that after taking on the Stasi, Nazi and the patriarchy, you might want to do something light next. Do you have anything on your docket, or are you just kind of enjoying the wifedom?
Actually, what Craig said was, what is it about you? First you take on the Stasi, then the Nazi, and then patriarchy. Are you done? I mean, he said it in a kind of friendly way, but it was also like a terrifyingly psychologically acute way. But actually, I'm not majorly interested in the Stasi, the Nazis, and patriarchy, although I can see why it would look that way. I am really interested in resistance. And that resistance that I have been most interested in has, I look back now, been female or female-led or predominantly, apart from Klaus Rendt and Ernst Toller, women. So I'm looking at systems of power that we all live in that pretend to be invisible, and the people who knock up against it most bravely have been women in my experience. So that's what I'm interested in. I may or may not be able to shake that psychological quirk. I am working on a novel. I have said before, this book is going to be, light and short, a little dawdle, and I have failed astonishingly at being able to do that. So we'll see.
Well, look, Anna, thank you for being a fantastic guest on the podcast, and wishing you all the best with wifedom and with your other projects going forward.
Thank you so much. Sometimes I feel it's like too much attention, really, but thank you.
That was the Way to Take Notes interview with Anna Funder. She's on Twitter at Anna Funder. Her website is annafunder.com, and Wifedom is published by Viking. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Anna?
I thought it was very interesting to hit Orwell from another angle. We did via Paul Theroux recently. And I thought, very interesting in terms of the kind of genre crossing that she did in the book, and mixing bits of fiction or imaginative writing with nonfiction reporting. I also enjoyed hearing about her earlier work, and particularly, digging up the secrets of the Stasi in that sort of interesting time immediately after a regime has fallen, and her experiences of different literary cultures in the US and Australia and so forth. What about you?
Very much agree. I thought Anna was a really fun guest. I was chuckling throughout, particularly the bit about the unwitting catfish of Stasi agents in the newspaper. was very, very funny. And it reminded me oddly of the conversation with Patrick Warren-Keefe when he was talking about reporting on the Troubles and it being very useful to be an outsider in Northern Ireland reporting at that time. So her experiences of dealing with the Stasi quite similar. And I also found her to be very honest, particularly in describing the early fictionalized version of Stasi as execrable. So obviously, candour always appreciated on Always Take Notes. What have you been up to, Simon, and what have you been consuming?
I have been in archives, mostly, almost entirely actually. So I'm in the Alps doing the kind of final historical research for my book. So I started off in Geneva in the Alamaya archives, and then I moved to Valais, the canton of Valais, and I've been in the cantonal archives there, and I've been over in France, and I'm going again to France tomorrow, and then I go to Zurich and to Bern, and it's been unmitigatedly fascinating, actually. I have never done archival research before. But it's what I feel kind of vindicated in is I'm doing it basically the end of this book project. So when I largely have a draft written, and so I know, what I need and who, and I can be super, super precise. And I've had this sort of weird experience of all these people who died, between 30 and 50 years ago, kind of really coming to life in my head and emerging as characters and stuff like that. I was in the seeing the Elamaya photo archive this afternoon, which was all of today, which again was very, very interesting. So it's been very busy, but it's been going well. And in terms of things I'm reading, I am in theory still reading this book called Alpinisme Hivernal, Winter Alpinism, by a Swiss mountaineer called Marcel Kurtz, but I've been just having to read so much stuff during the day that I haven't really made any headway with that. What about you, Rachel? What have you been up to and what have you been consuming?
That sounds more than fair enough that you don't fancy more reading after a day of reading. I have just finished a book called The Editor about Judith Jones, which some listeners might be interested in. She was a long-time editor at Knopf, worked with people like John Updike and Sylvia Plath, but is most famous for her work on cookbooks. Particularly Julia Child and Mastering the Art of French Cooking. But it's a fascinating biography of her and her editorial judgment, but also offers an insight into the changes in publishing in the second half of the 20th century.
Is it a memoir by her?
No, it's a biography based on quite extensive interviews with her. And she left behind a huge amount of archival material, I think. So it's very, very detailed, but yes, I think people who are interested in the history of publishing, particularly American publishing, will find that enjoyable too.
This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.